save it on my computer. Excellent, and we're live. Mr. Simon Kemp, thank you so much for joining us for this NRI 2020 special interview on digital transformation. Do you want to tell us more about yourself and introduce yourself briefly?
Sure. Hi, Simon Kemp. Nice to meet you all. So I run a management consultancy called Kepios, which helps people all over the world to make sense of what the world is really doing online. And I also run DataReportal, which is a massive online library of free reports and trends insights into digital behaviors in every country in the world.
Excellent. And you've also worked on that global digital report that has, I believe, 10 million views.
Correct. So we produce those on behalf of We Are Social and Hootsuite. 10 million people read those every year. So hopefully plenty of insights from those reports that I can share with you as part of our conversation today.
Absolutely. And I just learned that you're Scottish, but you don't sound Scottish anymore, do you?
Originally. No, I moved to Singapore 15 odd years ago. My Scottish accent wasn't the easiest to translate, so I calmed it down a little bit, so I shall be neutral today.
Excellent, thank you. Alrighty, we barely have 30 minutes, so let's move on to the first question on the need of digital transformation. Feel free to give us a concrete example of what your organization has been dealing with, and what do you think an organization needs to be digitally transformed in order to stay competitive and survive in the case of a crisis like COVID, for instance?
Yes, I think there's very clear evidence in all of the data that we collect as part of our reports that digital is now an integrated part of most people's day-to-day lives. If you look at the latest data from every country in the world, we're looking at 60% of the world's total population already using the internet. But once you start looking at populations over the age of about 13, you're looking at much, much higher than that. So most people that want to use the internet already are, and those that aren't already using it are possibly, from an organizational perspective, they're in those different groups that perhaps are less targeted by businesses around the world. I don't mean that in a judgmental sense, but I think from a commercial perspective, if you're not online, then you're missing out on a large chunk of what people do. So the research that we've seen from companies like Global Web Index show that roughly sort of 40% of our waking lives are spent online as human beings around the world. That's an average. So obviously there are some people like the Philippines, for example, massively over indexes 10 hours a day on the internet. It's just absolutely crazy. So if you're not on digital, then you're missing out on a big opportunity. I think it's important to stress that this is not an obligation. It's much more of an opportunity. And if businesses aren't taking advantage of that, then they're missing out on possible sales, great ways to communicate, all sorts of different stuff. So yeah, I think from an opportunity perspective, you'd be crazy not to want to be a part of a more digitally integrated world.
Excellent. And so what do you think this pandemic is changing? Or is there something we should do better in times of crisis?
So the sort of behaviors that people adopted during lockdowns, and this is consistent across the world, but in certain countries you see bigger spikes in different activities. But the research that we've collected very clearly shows that there was a huge increase in digital activity as a result of lockdown. I don't think that comes as a surprise to anybody, but the extent to which people spending more time online has grown. I think that might be a little bit of a shock. So we're seeing at least half of internet users saying that they've been spending more time doing things like streaming content, whether that's on YouTube or platforms like Netflix, spending a lot more time on social media, spending more time playing video games, all sorts of different stuff. And I think, part of that is because they had limited options. So when you're stuck at home and you're not allowed to leave your house, then the internet is a great way to connect to all sorts of different distractions and entertainment, but also to learn new things. But I think what's been really interesting is that a lot of the behaviors that people adopted during lockdown have survived the transition out of lockdown as well. So many countries already sort of starting to try to return to normal at the moment. And I think it's very clear that in particular things like online shopping have gained some momentum during lockdown, which we should expect to see lasting a lot longer than the pandemic itself. So older folks that might have resisted, especially when it comes to things like grocery shopping, older demographics had resisted that for a while. They were forced to use it during lockdown, and they've realized that actually this is really convenient. They can find the things that they want. The vegetables that they buy are not damaged when they arrive. And so they're kind of looking at this and going, this is actually a lot more convenient than having to go out to the store every few days. So maybe I'll continue with this as part of my overall lifestyle as well. So definite big changes there from a customer perspective. When it comes to businesses and how they work, very clear that a significant number of white collar workers have transitioned to working from home, either as a default or as a part of a more blended kind of behavior now, but that's definitely going to continue in the longer term as well. I think people will go back to offices and they'll definitely want to return to face-to-face meetings as part of their routines. But the fact is that a lot of businesses resisted digital transformation before COVID, and now they've been forced into it and they've realized that it works and people still get the job done. So maybe that helps them reduce costs, their staff are happier, there's all sorts of benefits and opportunities there. So yeah, a lot of those lockdown behaviors will last a lot longer than lockdown itself.
Excellent. This is great. And I see you're thinking long term. So I hear that not being on the internet is missing opportunities. I think this is going to be linked to question number 2 on the digital divide. We can talk about that right away. And also I hear the lockdown behavior between entertainment and learning from a customer experience and also from businesses that might have resisted the temptation before, but now are taking it more seriously in reducing cost, for example. Very good. So going back to the digital divide, do you have any insight on how companies, organizations, governments, pretty much all kinds of stakeholders can actually help fight unemployment due in a post-crisis world thanks to digital transformation? Do you have any concrete example there?
Yes, I think that part of this also, now that we're realizing that remote work is a lot easier than perhaps some organizations might have thought about, there is an opportunity to spread your workforce much more widely geographically. So for example, even within an individual country itself, you've got parts of the country that perhaps suffer from exaggerated unemployment, the far away from the capital, the smaller towns and cities where people perhaps used to work in certain kinds of industries that are no longer as successful as they used to be. Those people perhaps they don't want to move away from the places where they live, but as a result of living in those smaller towns, they had much lower numbers of opportunities compared to perhaps the capital city or larger cities. What we're seeing now is with all these people working from home, you can be a greatly dispersed workforce. So even if you're still wanting to reside in a small village out in the countryside, you can still take part in a very vibrant digital business or even work for one of the world's largest sort of multinationals or whatever else. So even within a country, there's lots of opportunities there for digital to sort of ensure that there is equal opportunity right the way across the nation. But even thinking more broadly than just within a country, I think when you start looking at international opportunities, the ability for businesses now to go beyond their own borders and find people in other countries that they can work with. I mean, working from home can be on a beach on the other side of the world if that's what the member of staff wants to do. So all of these opportunities have opened up, and that benefits businesses as much as it benefits the potential employee as well. So it's perhaps much more about mindset than anything else. I think previously we resisted, like I said before, but now that we've seen that this is possible, if people just expand their minds beyond their existing employees and think, well, I could employ anybody anywhere around the world, matches the basic sort of requirements for the job in terms of skills, and that that's got huge potential and it's got huge opportunity as well. Absolutely.
Excellent. So I hear that the opportunities for workers more spread geographically, a greatly dispersed workforce and equal opportunities. The word equal is extremely important over here. Work from home facilities from the beach or wherever. And also it would benefit employees and employers, and it's all about the mindset. Absolutely. Great. What can you tell us about globalization? This is just a bonus sub question. Do you think this pandemic is going to help with globalization or de-globalization?
It's funny because it's gone in both directions at the same time. I think you've sort of seen it stretch to the edges, if you like. So on one side, I think a lot of companies in the early stages of the pandemic realized that they were greatly at risk from being dependent on other countries where the pandemic hit hardest. So all those companies that had outsourced their manufacturing to China, when the outbreak sort of gained momentum in China at the start of the pandemic, it was a disaster because all this stuff just was no longer available for all these companies. But at the same time, I think trying to do stuff within your own country has also been a bit of a challenge because people have realized that it's not like it's just that they're dependent on cheaper labor elsewhere. There's skills that they're not able to find in particular other geographies as well. So I think there's this sort of balance of views between the risks of having a greatly dispersed and distributed sort of manufacturing pipeline, if you like, but also the fact that we rely on different skill sets around the world and different realities of economic function. So I think it's highlighted both sides of the divide. Unfortunately, I think there's been an awful lot of political posturing that's gone with it. So certain countries that have made unfortunate choices, I think I might say, based on the fact that they want to be quite insular about how they respond to this. And I don't think that that is necessarily going to put them in the best opportunity and the best position going forward because of those differences in skill sets and whatever else. So it's just highlighted an awful lot of things that perhaps we should have been thinking about before and have been putting off for too long.
Are we saying we should have had more forward thinking, like your episode in August 2017? You were saying the new normal, that the internet, was bursting and everybody was online, and so I think you were already ahead of your time 2 years ago.
I think that the idea of being able to predict the pandemic was a little bit beyond most businesses. I know that the WHO have been warning about this for some time, but I think the reality of just how much this has impacted day-to-day life, nobody in the business world certainly would have expected that. But certainly in terms of like embracing the opportunities that this brings, whether it's just that distributed workforce that we talked about or being able to reach customers on the other side of the world through e-commerce, I think it seems odd to me that companies hadn't done more to embrace that. Now they've been forced to do it. Hopefully they've seen the opportunity as much as the challenges that went with it. But yeah, like I said earlier, I think it'd be very surprising if businesses didn't want to continue with the opportunities that they've now discovered.
Mm-hmm. So mindset all about, yeah. So you've mentioned e-commerce manufacturers and all kinds of different stakeholders, as I call them, or industries. And if I mention AI and all kinds of new technologies, if we take it to question number 3 on talent, I'm hearing what you say is more workforce dispersed and also higher competition, right? There's workforce available all around the globe. So on talent, and how would you say reskilling and upskilling and lifelong learning are becoming crucial in this post-crisis world?
Yeah, so you mentioned AI there, and I think that there is a lot of concern that AI is going to take away all the jobs. I wouldn't dispute that in specific cases that may happen. Unfortunately, you will find certain individuals that are no longer able to do the jobs that they had been doing previously, but this is not specific to AI. I mean, we've seen this throughout history. The printing press comes along and certain groups of people lose their jobs because the printing press does what they used to do. And all new technologies bring with them some kind of risk. And it's not like society collapsed completely as a result of these new technologies. So exactly to your point, I think it's a case of reskilling, of finding where you can fit as an individual within that new world if you have found that your skills have been replaced by a technology. But even if that's not the case, I think a lot of kids growing up today, they're being asked by careers counselors at school what they want to do when they grow up. And the reality is that because technology is changing so fast, by the time they get through to the end of school and perhaps through to the end of higher education as well, the jobs that they're going to be doing don't exist today. And that's a massive opportunity. So I think as much as it's about reskilling, it's about changing the way that we think for a digital world. So a lot of education that, especially in the time that I grew up in, so 20, 30 years ago when I was at school, we were being taught for a world that was based on the reality of 10 years previous to that. So already it was slightly out of date. Just as I was leaving school, the internet became a thing. And I was in no way prepared for that. And I think, I'd never considered the possibility of being an entrepreneur when I was a student even. And it was only sort of 5-10 years into my career that I realized that the internet made this so much more possible than I had thought previously. And I think it's as a result of that, education is going to need to focus a lot more on mindsets and creativity than it is on equipping you with specific skills, I suppose, that will allow you to do a job as used to be. So look at something like science. You're going to need to know the basics of physics and biology and chemistry and whatever else, but how you apply that and what you use those things for is going to be very different to what they were used for in the past. So I think it's that, once again, a mindset's probably going to become a recurring theme through our conversation today, but it's very much educating to be able to innovate rather than educating to be able to follow a series of instructions and execute those.
Absolutely. So mindset and creativity over particular skills. But again, it would depend on the industry, etc. However, if I may challenge you, it's kind of the snake biting its own tail, because if there is a digital gap and then some people are not online, how are they supposed to learn and educate themselves?
Yeah. And this is one of the most interesting things about the world of digital today. And if you think about all of the things that have been disrupted by the internet and connected technologies, it's surprising that education isn't at the top of that list. In theory, the internet totally democratizes access to education. There should no longer be, as long as you have access to even a basic internet connection, which admittedly is still not ubiquitous, but let's just assume that 10 years from now, everybody will have at least basic access to the internet. Why we haven't seen a massive change in the way that education gets delivered, it surprises me. Now, obviously, COVID has started some things there, and we've learned some of the challenges of trying to do home learning and all that kind of stuff. And sure enough, kids need to interact with each other as part of their learning as well. But access to teachers, access to mentors and people that inspire you should be, I believe, way more easy than it is today. Part of that's because education is politicized. It's one of the ways that we sort of shape people into our societies, if you like. And so you've got a big difference between East and West education, but even within countries that are close to each other. So I think it's understanding whether or not you see education as a tool or education as a way to set people up for a future that's going to look quite different to the one that perhaps the politicians of today grew up in. I'll stop there before I get undiplomatic about my answer.
We don't want to do that, do we?
No.
Next question, a quick one on SDGs. Can you tell us more about, do you happen to have any concrete examples of best practices for leveraging technology to achieve the SDGs, be it climate or health or all those things that we're trying to tackle for a better world?
Yeah, so enabling lots of diverse groups of people, whether it's enabling women to become a more active part of the workforce, whether it's enabling sort of minorities, for want of a better word, the technology democratizes that. Whether that access to that technology is restricted is a slightly different question. But I think one of the bits that I've been most involved in when it comes to the SDGs is around gender. So we still see, unfortunately, quite a big divide when it comes to access to the internet for women in developing parts of the world, particularly in Southern Asia and in sub-Saharan Africa. And it's unfortunate because there's no reason why women should have any less access to a mobile device with an internet connection. It's not like there's a physiological reason that they shouldn't have access to this stuff. The good news is that once they get access to that, then there are so many opportunities that opens up, whether it's access to employment, access to healthcare, access to advice, social support, you name it. You think of all the different things that you can do on the internet. It's much easier to think about the things that you can't do on the internet. There's practically nothing that you cannot do anymore. And the good news is that once we're able to get devices and connections into the hands of these people that have previously been excluded for whatever reason, that access becomes a lot easier, especially in remote areas. So, you look at the efforts that a lot of governments, but also private organizations are going to make sure that access is universal in terms of you are able to do it. It would be really disappointing, I think, if a decade from now we don't see a dramatic change in at least the opportunities for people that are underserved in today's societies.
Absolutely. Great. Last question on NRI 2019 last year, the top 3 of the most technology-ready countries were Sweden, Singapore, and the Netherlands. You're based in Singapore and you have been for the last 15 years, coming from Europe originally. What would you say Singapore is doing well? And who knows, they might be in the top 3 this year too. I can't disclose that yet.
Yes, I would be surprised if they're not at the higher end of the ranking. I think Singapore takes a very holistic view to building a country and a society. We're very fortunate here. It's a very small place, so it's a lot easier to do these things at scale than perhaps it would be in a really dispersed country like Canada. It just, the distances involved make it really difficult. But the government...
Not to mention it's a country, city, island. It's got all those things, right? It's quite unique.
Yeah, culturally here as well, as Singaporeans, we love our gadgets. So we're predisposed to be at that sort of more early adopter end of the technology chain anyway. But I think just in terms of the way that the government approaches it, they like to bake the smart city stuff into everything that we do. They've got a very long-term vision for how the internet works. They're making it as accessible as possible to everybody. They're encouraging businesses, but also education establishments to make it a core part of everything that they do. So it's not like it is a separate thing, if you like. Digital connectivity and everything that goes with it is baked into each of the different initiatives that the government runs, whether it's healthcare or education or even transport. It fascinated me when I first moved here that you could get full speed mobile internet on the subway. You know, even you're underground and you've still got this perfect experience. Whereas coming from London, it was just like, well, you can't even get mobile reception, let alone digital connections in London. I know that's changed now, but at the time it was just that. So yeah, I think, you know, if you look at Scandinavia as well, I know that you said that they were on the list last year. It's really interesting. That again feels quite cultural. If you look at the internet adoption rates across Scandinavia, incredibly high across the Nordics, so Iceland as well. It partly comes down, once again, to mindset, I suppose, and just whether people are willing to embrace new technologies and integrate them into their everyday life versus seeing it as a threat to the way that we live today. So yeah, I mean, it's partly governmental and it's partly societal and cultural.
Absolutely. Speaking of culture, I'm just thinking, it looks like you're sitting on a couch. I love it. It's like you're in front of me. We're having this live conversation with two computers, but this is great.
The joys of working from home. It's great, isn't it?
We still have time for a bonus question. Are you ready?
Bonus, go for it.
I hope it's not too challenging or putting you on the spot. Nobody knew about this pandemic. You've mentioned that before. What would you tell your old self back in February? Is there something you would do differently because this COVID was getting here? I don't know if you've been asked that in the last few weeks, but is there something you would do differently, pretty much? On digital.
I would have bought a few more tools. I've spent the last 6 months trying to get hold of a lot of stuff that's been out of stock. I'm sure that's the case for many people as well. I think just realizing that so much of the stuff that I did before I could have given as an option online, and it probably would have been better for a lot of the clients that I did work with. So a huge amount of my personal work involved speaking at conferences. And obviously that hasn't happened for the last 6 months, but I've been doing an awful lot of it via webinar. And it feels like actually a lot of the time, the experience from a webinar is easier. Q&A becomes a lot more straightforward. Because you've got smaller groups that aren't scared about putting their hand up. They just, you know, they can ask a question in the text and you can answer it that way. So it goes back to that. Did I resist, or was I just not sort of thinking more broadly? I think that's the bit that I would suggest to myself previously, is these are options that are very easy to offer. I'm sure I'm still missing a lot of the ones that I could be thinking about now. So it's that bit of take a moment to step back and look at what all the opportunities that digital and digital transformation in particular offers, and think, what are the reasons I'm not doing this today? Is it really because it's technologically challenging, or it's expensive, or is it just because I haven't allocated enough time to think about it? Because in reality, I think it's that time bit that's the biggest barrier.
Or all of the above.
All of the above as well. But if it's just that I am sort of procrastinating, which is the reality far too often, there's not really an excuse for that. So try it out, you know, have a think about, is there a way that you could do part of your business online that you would previously have never considered doing online, and what might that look like? And, you know, it's opened up entire new business models for us, which is great. So sure enough, it's been challenging, but it's also been an opportunity.
And that's how you're helping tons of clients around the world, I guess.
Yes, hopefully. How long may that continue as well?
Great. Do you have anything else to add?
Just if anybody is looking for the latest data for their countries, we offer our reports completely for free. So if anybody's struggling to find the latest insights into what's happening in their particular market, if you head over to datareportal.com, I'm sure we can make this as part of the work that you're doing and integrate that in there as well. But if you want immediate updates on your country, then datareportal.com has all of that for free.
Excellent. Well, right there. I'm showing 11 a.m. over here, or 12 a.m. over here. So this is perfect, 12 p.m. Thank you so much. And we'll be in touch. I can't promise yet how.